She never said it publicly. She never wrote it down. She never allowed herself to speak the words aloud, even in private. But Queen Elizabeth II had thoughts about Princess Diana, complex, contradictory, deeply conflicted thoughts, that she carried silently for 25 years. What the monarch really believed about the daughter-in-law, who captivated the world and threatened her crown, remained one of the best-kept secrets in royal history, until now. Now you will hear a dramatized reflection inspired by the emotions, relationships, and public struggles behind this chapter of royal history. When Diana first appeared on the royal radar in 1980, Elizabeth's initial impression was cautiously positive. Here was a young aristocratic girl from an appropriate family, shy and deferential, seemingly perfect for Charles. She had the pedigree, the youth, the virginity that the institution required. More importantly, she appeared malleable, someone who could be shaped into the role of Princess of Wales without the rebellious streak that had made other potential candidates unsuitable. Elizabeth saw Diana as a solution to a growing problem. Charles was 32 and still unmarried, causing increasing public speculation and institutional concern. The heir needed a wife, needed to produce heirs, needed to settle the question of succession. Diana seemed like the answer, young enough to be guided, traditional enough to adapt, eager enough to cooperate. What Elizabeth didn't see, or chose not to see, was the vulnerability beneath Diana's compliance, the desperate need for love and approval that made her say yes to a man she barely knew, the emotional fragility that would make her unable to withstand the crushing demands of royal life, the romantic idealism that would be shattered by the reality of Charles's continued attachment to Camilla. Elizabeth had been trained from birth to suppress emotion, to prioritize duty over personal feelings, to sacrifice individual happiness for institutional stability. She genuinely believed anyone could learn these skills if properly motivated. She had done it. Her mother had done it. Margaret had failed to do it and paid the price. Diana, Elizabeth assumed, would simply need to try harder. But no one knew the real consequence of Elizabeth's fundamental misunderstanding of Diana's nature, or how it would poison their relationship from the beginning. The wedding in July 1981 reinforced Elizabeth's initial assessment. Diana looked perfect, young, beautiful, radiantly happy. The public response was overwhelming. The monarchy's popularity soared. Elizabeth felt vindicated in her judgment. Diana was exactly what the institution needed, a fresh, appealing face to modernize the crown's image while maintaining traditional values. The problems began almost immediately, but Elizabeth initially dismissed them as normal adjustment difficulties. Diana's weight loss during the engagement had been concerning, but Elizabeth attributed it to pre-wedding nerves. The reports of crying fits and emotional outbursts were troubling, but Elizabeth believed they would stop once Diana settled into her role. The whispers about Charles's continued contact with Camilla were uncomfortable, but Elizabeth had weathered her own husband's rumored infidelities and assumed Diana could do the same. What Elizabeth really thought during those early years was that Diana was weak, not maliciously weak, not deliberately difficult, but constitutionally unable to develop the emotional discipline that royal life demanded. Elizabeth had learned to compartmentalize, to separate public duty from private feeling, to endure rather than resist. Diana seemed incapable of learning these essential skills. Imagine the growing frustration Elizabeth felt as Diana's struggles intensified rather than resolved. The bulimia that palace staff reported with increasing frequency, the suicide attempts that were hushed up and categorized as attention-seeking, the constant demands for emotional support that Charles couldn't or wouldn't provide, the tears, the scenes, the increasingly desperate behavior. Elizabeth genuinely didn't understand. She had married Philip at 21, just a year older than Diana. She had adapted to royal life without complaint. She had endured decades of tabloid speculation about her husband's fidelity without ever publicly acknowledging it. She had subordinated every personal desire to her duty as monarch. Why couldn't Diana simply do the same? What happened next would begin to crack Elizabeth's certainty about Diana's weakness. The public adored Diana in ways they had never adored Elizabeth. The crowds that greeted Diana were larger, more enthusiastic, more emotionally engaged than anything the Queen had experienced in 4 decades of reign. Diana's popularity wasn't based on respect for the institution or reverence for tradition. It was based on something much more powerful and much more dangerous to the monarchy's established order. People loved Diana because she seemed human, vulnerable, accessible, because she showed emotion rather than suppressing it, because she broke rules rather than following them. Elizabeth watched this phenomenon with deeply mixed feelings. Part of her was pleased. Diana's popularity strengthened the monarchy's public standing and secured the succession's future. But another part, a part Elizabeth barely acknowledged to herself, felt threatened. Diana's success was built on rejecting everything Elizabeth had sacrificed her life to maintain: the emotional restraint, the rigid protocol, the institutional loyalty. Diana was proving that you didn't need those things to be beloved, that perhaps they had never been necessary at all. That realization, uncomfortable and destabilizing, shifted something in Elizabeth's thoughts about Diana. The weakness Elizabeth had perceived began to look more like courage. The inability to adapt began to look more like refusal to be diminished. Diana wasn't failing at being royal in the traditional sense. She was succeeding at being royal in a completely new way that the institution couldn't control. And what happened next would force Elizabeth to confront an even more uncomfortable truth. By the mid-1980s, the marriage's breakdown was impossible to ignore. Charles and Diana were barely speaking except in public. The War of the Wales, as the press gleefully called it, was playing out through carefully orchestrated leaks and strategic media manipulation. Diana was clearly the more skilled player in this game, instinctively understanding how to use her image and her emotional honesty to win public sympathy. Charles appeared cold and entitled by comparison. Elizabeth was caught in an impossible position. As monarch, she needed to support her son and protect the institution. As a woman, she couldn't entirely dismiss Diana's complaints. Charles' relationship with Camilla was ongoing and increasingly blatant. Diana's accusations of emotional abuse and institutional neglect weren't entirely unfounded. The palace's treatment of Diana, isolating her, dismissing her mental health struggles, demanding she perform happiness while refusing to address her legitimate grievances, was objectively cruel. What Elizabeth really thought during this period was complicated and contradictory. She believed Diana was manipulative, using her media savvy to wage war against the family. But she also believed Diana had been genuinely damaged by the marriage and the institution's failure to support her. She thought Diana was being selfish in prioritizing her personal happiness over duty, but she also wondered if perhaps duty had been asked to bear too much weight, to justify too many cruelties. Elizabeth had spent her entire life believing that institutional loyalty justified personal sacrifice, that the monarchy's survival required individuals to subordinate their needs to collective stability. Diana's rebellion challenged that fundamental belief. What if the price was too high? What if asking people to sacrifice their mental health, their happiness, their very sense of self for the institution was indefensible? These questions tormented Elizabeth in private, though she never spoke them aloud. To admit them would be to admit that her own sacrifices, decades of emotional suppression, of duty over desire, of crown over personal fulfillment, might have been unnecessary. that perhaps she could have been both queen and fully human, that the choice she'd believed was inevitable had actually been imposed by a system that didn't need to be so rigid. But no one knew the real consequence of Elizabeth's growing doubt, or how Diana's very existence was forcing the queen to question everything she'd built her life upon. The separation in 1992 brought both relief and failure. Elizabeth had worked behind the scenes to hold the marriage together, not because she particularly cared about Charles and Diana's happiness, but because divorce would damage the monarchy's image and complicate the succession. When it became clear the marriage couldn't be saved, Elizabeth felt she had failed in her duty as both queen and family matriarch. What she really thought about Diana during this period was darker and more resentful. Diana had refused to play by the rules that had governed royal life for generations. She had prioritized her own emotional needs over institutional stability. She had weaponized her popularity against the family. From Elizabeth's perspective, Diana was destroying everything the queen had spent her life protecting. But beneath the resentment was something Elizabeth barely admitted to herself: envy. Diana had done what Elizabeth never could. She had refused to be diminished. She had insisted on being seen as fully human, rather than merely royal. She had broken free, or tried to, even though it meant war with the most powerful institution in Britain. There was something admirable in that refusal to be conquered, even if Elizabeth could never say so. The Panorama interview in 1995 was, for Elizabeth, both devastating and clarifying. 23 million people watched Diana methodically dismantle the mythology the palace had spent decades constructing. She exposed Charles's adultery, questioned his fitness to be king, revealed her own struggles with bulimia and depression that the palace had hushed up, and fundamentally challenged whether the institution itself was worth preserving in its current form. Elizabeth was reportedly shattered by the interview, not angry, devastated, because Diana had spoken truths that Elizabeth had spent her life denying: that the system was cruel, that it demanded inhuman sacrifices, that it crushed vulnerable people who couldn't or wouldn't conform, that loyalty to the institution had cost too much and protected too little. What Elizabeth really thought in the aftermath of that interview was that Diana was both right and unforgivable: right about the system's failures, right about the impossibility of the situation she'd been placed in, right about deserving better treatment, but unforgivable for speaking those truths publicly, for prioritizing personal vindication over institutional protection, for choosing her own liberation over the monarchy's stability. And what happened next would reveal the depth of Elizabeth's conflicted feelings about Diana. When Elizabeth wrote the formal letters urging Charles and Diana to divorce quickly, it was both pragmatic calculation and belated mercy. The marriage had become a spectacle that was damaging everyone involved. But beyond the institutional necessity, Elizabeth was acknowledging something she'd resisted for years: that perhaps some situations couldn't be endured, that maybe duty had limits, that sometimes walking away was braver than staying. The divorce in 1996 should have ended their relationship, but it didn't. Diana remained the mother of the future king and his brother. She remained monumentally popular, far more beloved than any current royal. She remained a threat to the institution's carefully controlled narrative, and she remained in Elizabeth's private thoughts, a constant reminder of the Queen's own compromises and sacrifices. What Elizabeth really thought about Diana during that final year before her death was softer than before. The anger had faded somewhat. There was something almost like grudging respect for Diana's resilience, for her refusal to disappear quietly despite the institution's best efforts to marginalize her. Elizabeth still believed Diana was wrong to have aired royal troubles publicly, but she was beginning to understand why Diana had felt she had no other choice. Then came August 31st, 1997, and everything changed forever. Diana was dead, killed in a Paris tunnel while fleeing paparazzi, and Elizabeth was left with the most complicated grief of her life. She grieved for William and Harry, who had lost their mother. She grieved for the wasted potential. The young life ended too soon. But she also felt something she could barely acknowledge: relief that the threat was over, that the destabilizing force Diana represented was permanently removed. And beneath the relief was crushing guilt for feeling it. Guilt for the support she'd never offered. Guilt for the conversations she'd never initiated. Guilt for choosing institutional protection over human compassion so many times that when Diana died, they were barely on speaking terms, despite being family. What Elizabeth really thought about Diana in death became gradually clear through her actions over the following years. She allowed Charles to marry Camilla, something that would have been unthinkable if Diana lived. She supported William and Harry's desire for more authentic, less constrained royal lives. She slowly, almost imperceptibly, softened some of the rigid protocols that had made Diana's life so impossible. These changes weren't announced or explained. Elizabeth never publicly admitted that Diana had been right about anything, but the modifications spoke to a quiet acknowledgement that perhaps the price the institution demanded was too high, that perhaps Diana's inability to conform wasn't weakness, but a reasonable response to unreasonable demands. In her final years, those close to Elizabeth reported she occasionally mentioned Diana, always with a particular tone: wistful, regretful, complicated. What she really thought about Diana by the end was something she never articulated fully, but it might have been this: Diana was both everything wrong with modern royalty and everything it needed to survive. She was destructive to the old order and essential to creating a new one. She was impossible to work with and impossible to dismiss. She was the problem and perhaps the solution, if only the institution had been flexible enough to adapt to her rather than demanding she adapt to it. Elizabeth died in September 2022, taking her fully honest thoughts about Diana to the grave. But the evidence of those thoughts remained in the changes she slowly, reluctantly made, in her support for William and Harry's different approach to royal life, in her eventual acceptance of Charles and Camilla, in the small ways she bent protocols she'd once considered sacred. What the Queen really thought about Diana was complicated, contradictory, and evolved over 25 years. She thought Diana was weak and then courageous, manipulative and genuine, selfish and justified, a threat to everything she'd built and perhaps the key to its survival. She resented Diana and envied her, dismissed her and learned from her, tried to control her and was forced to respect her refusal to be controlled. In the end, what Elizabeth really thought about Diana was perhaps this: she was the daughter-in-law who wouldn't conform, couldn't be contained, refused to be silenced, and in doing so, revealed truths about the institution that Elizabeth had spent her life denying. And those truths, uncomfortable as they were, couldn't be unlearned. The Queen never said any of this publicly. She maintained her silence, her protocol, her institutional loyalty until death. But Diana changed her anyway, slowly and quietly, in ways Elizabeth barely admitted to herself. Some thoughts are too dangerous to speak aloud, even in private, especially when they challenge everything you've built your life upon.